After World War II, you'd think Europe could finally breathe, but instead a new, quieter conflict started to brew: the Cold War. The continent found itself split right down the middle, a division that got locked in place by two of the most powerful military alliances in history. So today, we're going to dive into how NATO and the Warsaw Pact were forged. If you really want to get to the heart of why the West created NATO, you don't need to look much further than this one quote. It's blunt, but it perfectly sums up the three big fears driving Western Europe: fear of the Soviets, fear of a newly powerful Germany, and a desperate need to keep America locked in as a protector. That mindset is what paved the way for this whole new alliance. So, let's start with NATO, the West Shield. You have to understand, there was this wave of genuine fear sweeping across Western nations that standing alone just wasn't going to cut it anymore. And what's really striking is just how fast everything happened. One minute, in 1948, there's a communist coup in Czechoslovakia. Then, that same year, Stalin blockades West Berlin. Talk about a clear message. To the West, this looks like the Soviet Union was a real and immediate threat. So they decided they needed a formal military alliance, and they needed it yesterday.
And the solution they came up with? Well, it was revolutionary. It's called Article 5, the idea of collective defense. This basically meant that the United States was tying its own safety directly to Western Europe. An attack on, say, Paris or Oslo was now officially an attack on New York. For America, this was a massive shift, a total reversal of its long-held policy of staying out of entangling alliances.
So these are the original 12 nations that signed on. And as you can see, it was a truly transatlantic deal. You've got North America, Western Europe, Southern Europe, everyone banding together. This made it crystal clear: the US was here to stay as a military power on the continent, creating a massive shield against any potential Soviet aggression. Okay, so NATO gets formed in 1949. Now, a lot of people just assume the Warsaw Pact popped up right after, as a direct tit-for-tat move. But that's actually not what happened. The real trigger, the thing that finally pushed the Soviets to create their own bloc, came 6 years later. And it was a decision that completely redrew the map of Europe. 6 years. That's a pretty big gap, right? It tells you that, yeah, NATO was definitely on the Soviet Union's mind, but it wasn't enough to make them create their own formal military alliance right away. Something else, something bigger, had to happen to really force their hand. So, that leads to the big question. If it wasn't just NATO itself, what was the one event that was so threatening to the Soviet Union that it finally made them say, okay, we have to formalize our own military bloc now? And here it is. The answer was West Germany. In 1955, West Germany was allowed to have its own army again, and then it joined NATO. You have to remember, the Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany less than 15 years earlier, and the cost was catastrophic. So from their perspective, seeing a booming West German economy, a new German army, and that army joining a hostile military alliance right on their doorstep, well, that was a line that just couldn't be crossed. And that brings us to the Soviet response. Literally within a week of West Germany joining NATO, the USSR made its move. They created the Warsaw Pact, an alliance designed to be the mirror image of NATO, and one that would last for the next 35 years. For Moscow, this wasn't just about balancing military power. This was about an existential threat, and it was rooted in very recent, very brutal history. A powerful, rearmed Germany backed by the United States was, for them, an absolutely unacceptable risk. From their point of view, creating the Warsaw Pact was a defensive move they had to make. But here's the thing. The pact was really doing two jobs at once. On the one hand, yes, it was designed to counter NATO, but it was also a tool to tighten Moscow's grip on its Eastern European satellite states. Seeing nearby Austria had just been granted neutrality, and the Soviets were worried that countries like Hungary might start getting ideas about doing the same. The Warsaw Pact basically gave the Soviet Union the formal right to keep its troops in those countries, making sure they stayed put in the communist bloc. So when you put them side by side, the differences are just crystal clear. NATO, born in 1949 out of a fear of the Soviets. The Warsaw Pact, coming 6 years later, triggered specifically by West German rearmament. And while NATO was built around this idea of collective defense, the Warsaw Pact, well, it was an instrument of direct Soviet command. No question about it. So once these two blocs were in place, the Iron Curtain wasn't just a political phrase anymore. It became a hard military reality. Europe was now officially, formally, split into two armed camps, and that set the stage for decades of high-stakes confrontation. Now, you might think, okay, surely both sides would try to de-escalate, right? But the Geneva summit, right after the Warsaw Pact was formed, shows the exact opposite. The US proposed an open skies treaty to let each side fly over and check for weapons. The Soviets said, no way. The Soviets then proposed, hey, let's just dismantle both our alliances. Or how about a neutral united Germany? The West rejected both ideas. Nobody was willing to give an inch.
And the takeaway from all this is pretty stark. Diplomacy had failed. The division was now set in stone. The entire continent was locked in this tense stalemate that would drive global politics, fuel a terrifying arms race, and basically define life for millions of people for the next 3.5 decades.
And that brings us right up to today. The Warsaw Pact is long gone, a relic of history. But NATO? Not only is it still here, it's actually grown. This isn't just ancient history. It's the bedrock of the world we live in now. And it leaves us with a really critical question. What is the real, lasting legacy of these two armed camps? And how does that division continue to shape our world?